On Saturday, November 14th, 1998, 35-year-old Sarah Raris and her best friend Laura scanned the racks at a local clothing store in Howard County, Maryland. Sarah wasn't really looking to buy any new clothes, but she was desperate to distract herself from the horrible day she was having, and she hoped shopping might help with that. This was one of the weekends that her estranged husband, Lorenzo, had custody of their 1-year-old son, and Sarah hated every minute she was apart from her baby. Sarah and her husband were in the middle of a heated divorce and custody battle, and if she had her way, Lorenzo would actually never see their son again. Just then, Laura pointed out a shirt that she thought Sarah might actually like. It would look great with Sarah's red hair, she said. Sarah forced a smile, but deep down she knew that this retail therapy was not having the desired effect. Sarah continued to walk around the store, but she just couldn't shake herself out of her bad mood. And this frustrated her, because she'd always prided herself on being this really upbeat, positive person. In fact, up until about a year ago, Sarah's life had seemed almost perfect. She worked as a statistician for the National Security Agency, or NSA for short, helping solve a range of information security issues for multiple federal agencies. Sarah had always had a gift for mathematics, and so using her talent to help her country was like a dream job for her. Also, at the time, she had begun writing her first novel, a murder mystery about a brilliant statistician who solves crimes, and she and her husband Lorenzo had bought this beautiful house in a suburban neighborhood that looked like something out of a painting. The streets were lined with manicured lawns and white picket fences. And perhaps most importantly for Sarah, she had become a mother. But soon after her baby was born, things at home had begun to fall apart. Lorenzo didn't seem to want anything to do with helping raise the child, so Sarah quickly felt like she was juggling this important government job with taking care of a newborn baby all on her own. Also, Sarah's family lived about 1,000 miles away in Alabama, so they weren't able to help. Luckily though, her mother-in-law, so Lorenzo's mom, had pitched in and began babysitting whenever she could, and also helping Sarah with cooking and cleaning. But Sarah's mother-in-law worked full-time at a retirement home, so there was only so much she could do. And no matter how much Sarah begged Lorenzo for his help, he basically just refused. After almost a year of this, Sarah just couldn't take it anymore, so she filed for divorce. However, as soon as she did that, Lorenzo suddenly began acting like he wanted to be with their child all the time. And so he made the divorce and custody proceedings very difficult for Sarah. Back in the store, Sarah's friend Laura asked her if there was anything Sarah wanted to try on. Sarah thanked Laura for going out with her and trying to help her get her mind off of things, but at this point, she said she just wanted to go home. Laura said she totally understood, and the two friends said goodbye and headed to their cars in the parking lot. A little later that night, Sarah opened up a notebook and her laptop on a coffee table in her family room and began working on her mystery novel. Then, at around 8:45 p.m., as she was still hard at work, she suddenly heard something and looked up, startled. She held her breath, trying to be as quiet as possible, but she didn't hear anything else. Still feeling unsettled, she got up, walked down the hallway to her bedroom, and then crouched down by her bed. And there, on the floor, she saw the large metal skillet, exactly where she kept it every night. Living by herself with her baby made her nervous, so this skillet let her feel like she had a weapon close by when she went to bed. But as Sarah stayed there crouched down by her bed for a second, she didn't hear any more noise anywhere in the house, and so she shook off her nerves and decided to leave the skillet behind. She told herself she was just being paranoid. And so Sarah stood back up, walked down the hallway, and sat down in the family room, getting ready to dive back into her mystery novel. However, just moments later, she heard the sound of shattering glass. At 7:45 p.m. on the following night, Sarah's friend Laura got home after being out for most of the day. She walked into her kitchen and tossed her keys on the counter, and she noticed the light on her answering machine was blinking. And so Laura picked up her phone, hit a button to play back the message, and the automated voice on the machine told her that this message had come in the previous night at 8:56 p.m. Laura figured she must have missed the call the night before and just not noticed she had this voicemail before she went out earlier. The voicemail began to play, and at first all Laura heard was static, and she thought maybe somebody had dialed accidentally and not left a message. but suddenly she heard heavy breathing and then screaming and crying, and then the message ended. Then the automated voice gave Laura the option to dial the number of that caller back. Laura just stood there for a second, completely freaked out by what she had just heard. She snapped out of it and hit that button to automatically return the call, and when she did, it went straight to Sarah's voicemail. Laura's hands started shaking. Now that she knew it was Sarah who had left this message, it was like the urgency went through the roof. And so she hung up and tried calling her friend right back, hoping maybe this time Sarah would pick up. But again, it just rung and went to voicemail. And so Laura hung up and immediately dialed 911. A few minutes later, a Howard County police officer pulled up in front of Sarah's house. He'd been out on patrol nearby when he got the call to do a wellness check at this address. The officer got out of his car and walked towards the front door. It was dark out, but there were lights on inside the house and also out in front of the house. However, before the officer even got to the front door, he froze. He saw that one of the front windows of the house had been smashed in, and there was glass laying all over the ground under the windowsill. His first thought was that he had just stumbled upon a robbery. And so the officer quickly went to the front door and knocked, but he barely waited before trying the doorknob. When he saw it was locked, the officer quickly used a special tool to unlock it, and then he opened up the door. The officer stepped inside the house and slowly began walking around, calling out to see if anybody was home, and keeping his hand hovering above his weapon. For all he knew, the robber might still be in the house and could be armed. The officer eventually made his way into the brightly lit family room. And when he did, he looked down at the floor, and as soon as he saw what was there, he turned and ran out of the house. He got to his cruiser, fumbled for his radio, and called for backup. It was close to 9 p.m. that night when Detective Nate Rettig of the Howard County Police stepped out of his car and approached the officer who had first arrived on the scene. By now, this quiet neighborhood had come to life. Detective Rettig saw neighbors standing on their porches, staring at all the police and first responders swarming outside of Sarah's house. Rettig spoke to the responding officer who had come to the house for a wellness check. He was a young officer who now looked completely shaken by what he had seen inside of the house. Luckily, Rettig, who was more senior than this young officer, had a very fatherly demeanor about him. He was tall and still and always appeared to be in total control. He spoke in a calm voice with a Baltimore accent, and he was able to get the young officer to calm down and also give him a detailed account of what he had seen inside of the house that had shaken him so. After that, Rettig told the young officer to just stay outside, and then Rettig put on his gloves and walked to the front door. Once inside, Rettig went straight to the family room, and when he looked down at what was on the ground, it shocked him too. He'd just walked into one of the goriest crime scenes he'd ever witnessed in his many years as a homicide detective. A woman who looked like she was in her 30s was covered in blood, and there was blood spatter all over the walls and the floor. But that wasn't all. The woman had clearly been hacked and stabbed at with a blade so violently and so many times that her head had nearly been decapitated and her hands were barely connected to her wrists. Rettig's first thought was that this had to have been a rage-filled overkill. I mean, several of the wounds he was looking at that had been inflicted on this woman individually should have been enough to kill her. But she had several of those fatal-seeming wounds. Also, a scene this brutal typically meant investigators were dealing with a crime of passion. Detective Rettig saw a purse sitting on the nearby coffee table. He looked inside of it and found a wallet with a driver's license inside. Despite all of the blood, he could still match the victim to the woman on this ID. The victim was Sarah Raris. Rettig knelt back down to get a better look at Sarah. He saw all the blood on her clothes and skin, and the blood on the walls and the floor had all dried. And Rettig knew that the woman who had called police to do the wellness check said she'd gotten a frightening voicemail from the victim, from Sarah, the night before. So it seemed logical to him, especially based on the dried nature of the blood, that Sarah had already been dead for 24 hours or so. Rettig stood up, walked back outside, and joined several forensics technicians and police officers who had also just arrived at the scene. He told the officers to start by talking to the neighbors, many of whom were still standing around and watching from their porches, to see if any of them had seen anything strange or heard anything strange the night before. Rettig hoped in a quiet neighborhood like this that maybe somebody heard the sound of that window shattering and came outside to take a look. Maybe they saw something. As the forensics team entered Sarah's house and began searching for prints and DNA samples, Rettig also went back inside and began a full walkthrough of the house. And as he did that, he noticed that somebody had clearly ransacked the place. But Rettig immediately thought this was all just staged to look like a robbery. It looked like a VCR had been pulled off its stand and stolen, there were VHS tapes littered all across the family room floor, and the kitchen drawers had all been pulled open. But Sarah's purse with cash and credit cards in it had been left behind on the coffee table, and so too had her jewelry and laptop, which were worth way more than a VCR. And so Rettig did not think this looked like a robbery gone bad. Also, just the brutality of the murder itself backed up his theory. As far as he was concerned, there was no way Sarah had been killed just by some random burglar. After searching the house for well over an hour, Rettig reconvened with the rest of the team. Forensics technicians had found bloody handprints on the wall, but those just indicated that the killer had been wearing gloves. But they did find several bloody footprints leading from the family room to the broken window and into the front yard. They would use these prints and the blood on the body, walls, and the floor to see if they could get any DNA samples that might belong to the killer. The officers who had been out canvassing the neighborhood said that unfortunately, nobody had seen or heard anything strange the night before. In fact, nobody had even noticed the shattered window at Sarah's house until the police arrived. This surprised Detective Rettig. This was not a neighborhood that experienced much crime at all, and so he really hoped that somebody had heard that broken glass and maybe thought there was a break-in going on and went out to investigate, but clearly not. But even still, the forensics team had plenty of samples for testing, and because of the brutal, sort of rage-filled nature of the crime, Rettig felt like he could start narrowing down potential suspects to only people who had a close, intimate relationship with their victim, Sarah. Rettig also knew there was another huge piece of evidence that was not in the house, the voicemail message that her friend Laura got that might have recorded her murder. As late night turned into early morning, Detective Rettig arrived at Sarah's friend Laura's house. Laura was still wide awake, desperately waiting to hear any news about Sarah. And so when she saw Rettig, she led him into her house and brought him into the front room, and when they got there, Rettig just told her she should sit down. Laura sat down on the couch and began shaking her head. It was like she already knew what was coming. Rettig told her that he was so sorry, but police had found her friend Sarah dead inside of her home, and she had clearly been murdered. Even though Laura by this point had sort of been expecting the worst, she refused to accept this at first. She said there was no way Sarah was gone. It had to be a mistake. Rettig watched Laura completely break down on the couch, sobbing and just repeating that police must have made a mistake. He again told her how sorry he was, and eventually Laura did begin to breathe a bit easier, and she wiped the tears from her eyes, and then she looked right at Rettig and said something that totally threw him for a loop. Laura told him that the police needed to arrest Sarah's soon-to-be ex-husband, Lorenzo, right away, because he was the one who had killed her. Rettig was used to victims' friends and families suggesting who they thought might have committed a murder, but it was Laura's complete confidence that just seemed strange to him. He told Laura that Sarah's husband, Lorenzo, would definitely be brought in for questioning, especially considering, it sounded like they were going through a divorce. Generally speaking, spouses and intimate partners were always the first suspects in murder cases like this. But Laura told him it wasn't just that they were getting a divorce. It was also that Sarah and Lorenzo were in the middle of this nasty custody battle over their child, and Laura said that Sarah was just plain terrified of Lorenzo. Laura told Rettig that Lorenzo had been living with his mother since he and Sarah had gotten separated. But one time, Lorenzo had shown up at Sarah's house and literally threatened to kill her. Sarah was so afraid that he would come back to hurt her and take their son far away from her that she kept a metal skillet under her bed as a weapon in case he ever showed up. Now, Rettig would obviously have to follow up on this claim. He had no idea if Laura was telling the truth or not, but it definitely seemed like Laura was being truthful, and he felt like he needed to act fast in case there was a chance that Lorenzo really was trying to leave town and take he and Sarah's son with him. And so Rettig asked Laura for her answering machine, that way police could study the message Sarah had left her. Laura said that was fine. She got up, unplugged the machine, and handed it to him, and then very quickly, he left her house with the machine and rushed out to his car. On his way back to the station, Rettig called in to ask for any records they had on Lorenzo Raris. And when he got back to his office, he found a file folder waiting for him on his desk. It would turn out Laura had been telling the truth. Sarah had called the police on her estranged husband, Lorenzo, a few months earlier, claiming he had threatened to kill her. Police had removed Lorenzo from the premises, and there was still a court order in place forbidding him from returning to Sarah's house. After reading this report, Rettig didn't waste any time. He requested a search warrant for Lorenzo's mom's house, Lorenzo's car, and for Lorenzo himself. This warrant would allow police to demand fingerprints and DNA samples from Lorenzo. Finally, Rettig sent 2 of his team members to Lorenzo's mother's house, where Lorenzo was living. They couldn't go into the house until the search warrant was granted, but Rettig wanted to have his eyes on Lorenzo, just in case he tried to make a run for it. By 10 a.m. on November 16th, so the day after Sarah's body was discovered, all of Detective Rettig's warrants had been approved. And so even though he had just worked through the night and he was starting to feel exhausted, he still gathered up several members of his team and they headed to Lorenzo's mom's house. At about the same time, Lorenzo stepped out of the house and got into his car to head to work. But before he could make it down the street, the 2 officers who'd already been there staking out the place pulled him over and told him to leave his car behind, and then they drove him to the police station. Rettig and his team arrived soon after that, and Rettig had Lorenzo's car impounded for a forensic search, and then they headed to Lorenzo's mother's house and they knocked on the front door. Lorenzo's mother, a small woman in her 60s named Amelia Raris, opened up the door. She was carrying Sarah and Lorenzo's young son in her arms, and she looked genuinely frightened. She didn't understand why there were police at her house. But very quickly, Rettig broke the news to her. He told her that unfortunately, her daughter-in-law, Sarah, had been killed the night before, and even though this is very abrupt and shocking for her, they did need to search her house and also ask her some questions. Amelia stared back at Rettig in total shock. She said that wasn't possible. Her son Lorenzo had just seen Sarah a couple of days ago to get their son. Rettig said he was terribly sorry, but this was the truth. And then he showed her the search warrant and said they really needed to come inside. Amelia nodded, still in shock, and led them inside, and then it was like she was on autopilot and just asked them if she could put the baby in his crib. Rettig said that was fine, and while Amelia sort of shuffled off, he instructed his team to do a thorough search of the house. A few minutes later, Amelia came back, still looking very confused and shocked, and she walked with Rettig into the kitchen. Rettig again apologized for the whole situation and for having barged into her home like this, but quickly asked her point blank if she knew where her son Lorenzo had been on the night Sarah had been murdered. She told Rettig she had had a late shift at the retirement home where she worked that night, so she didn't know. But her other son, Mike, would know where Lorenzo had been. And so Amelia called out for Mike. And suddenly, this man in his late 20s walked into the kitchen. It was Mike, and he looked just as frightened as his mother. He clearly had just been listening intently to Detective Rettig and Amelia have this conversation about Sarah being murdered. And so Rettig, who could tell Mike already knew what happened, he just asked the same question he had asked his mother. Did Mike know where Lorenzo had been on the night of Sarah's murder? Mike immediately stared down at the floor and just began shifting back and forth on his feet for a minute without saying anything. And then he looked up at Rettig and slowly nodded and said Lorenzo had actually been home that night. In fact, he and Lorenzo had hung out together that night for a little while before Mike had to leave for a night shift at his job. Rettig thought Mike seemed like he was hesitating as he was saying this, and so he couldn't tell if Mike was just nervous or scared or if he was trying to hide something. But either way, Rettig never put much stock in family-related alibis. Parents and siblings would often go to great lengths to protect a loved one, even if it meant lying to the police. And on top of that, even if this alibi were legitimate, Mike did not seem particularly clear on what time he actually left the house to go to that work shift. And so really, this alibi did not let Lorenzo off the hook at all. After that, Rettig joined his team and searched the house. Nothing really jumped out at them, no piece of evidence that made it clear Lorenzo could be a killer, but they were able to pull some fingerprints, and they collected a number of physical items that could be evidence that might help the investigation. Later that day, Detective Rettig returned to the police station and met with one of the investigators who had picked up Lorenzo. And this investigator told Rettig that there was something really strange about this whole thing. He said that when he and his partner met Lorenzo, one of the first things they told him was that his wife had been killed. And Lorenzo reacted by bending over and heaving and sobbing, but then when he stood back up again, it was clear he had not actually been crying at all. It was all an act. Now, Rettig didn't want to jump to conclusions here, but it was hard to deny that things were really lining up against Lorenzo. He was already an estranged husband in a heated custody battle who had previously threatened the victim, and now he seemed to be fake crying at the news of his wife's murder. The investigator told Rettig that Lorenzo was in an interview room, so Rettig grabbed a cup of coffee and headed that way. And after a few minutes of talking to Lorenzo, Rettig felt like his case was only getting stronger. The conversation they had was relatively short and to the point. Lorenzo said he was at his mother's house at the time Sarah had supposedly been killed, just like his brother Mike had said. Lorenzo also made it clear that despite all of the custody issues, he still cared about Sarah a lot, and he would never hurt her. But it was not Lorenzo's answers or his sort of flimsy family alibi that made Rettig feel like Lorenzo was now definitely his primary suspect. Instead, it was Lorenzo's attitude during this short interview. Rettig thought every answer this man gave him sounded smug and arrogant. And when he talked about his wife's death, he didn't show any emotion at all, despite the huge crying display he'd put on for the other investigators when they first told him about it. At the end of the interview, Rettig called in an officer to take Lorenzo's fingerprints and to swab his cheek for a DNA sample. After that, Rettig wanted to keep Lorenzo in custody, but he didn't have enough evidence to do that, so he had to let him go. But Rettig felt confident that it was only a matter of time before Lorenzo would be back at the station, back in police custody. On November 20th, so 6 days after Sarah's murder, her friends and family gathered at a local church for her funeral. And they were joined by people from the community who didn't even know Sarah, but who had followed her story closely on the local news day after day. Detective Rettig and members of his team also attended, and it struck Rettig that everyone who spoke at the service was so bright and positive when speaking about Sarah. Even though everybody was still in shock and heartbroken, they said Sarah had spent her life being happy and spreading joy, so they wanted to honor her by doing the same, even now at her funeral. But that was not the only thing about the funeral that stood out to Rettig. It was common for investigators to attend funerals of murder victims, specifically to watch how potential suspects might react. But Rettig couldn't really fully do that because his primary suspect wasn't even there. Lorenzo and his family had not shown up to Sarah's funeral. About a week after the funeral, Rettig was sitting at his desk going over notes from the search of Lorenzo's mother's house. Nothing had really come from the search so far, and he was starting to feel stuck. He was still waiting on DNA test results from the crime scene and Lorenzo's car, and without these results, or some clear evidence from the search, he still couldn't move in on Lorenzo, or anyone else for that matter. Just then, Rettig heard somebody call his name, and he looked up and he saw an excited officer flagging him down, telling him there was something he needed to hear right away. And so Rettig followed this officer down a hallway to a small room where a member of the investigative team was hunched over Laura's answering machine. This investigator had spent days trying to break down the voicemail recording of the breathing and the screaming and the crying into small sections to see if he could isolate anything that would help. The investigator, when they saw Rettig, waved him over and rewound the voicemail Sarah had left on the night of the murder and played it back. And when it reached a certain spot, the investigator stopped the message and looked at Rettig like he had just discovered something major. But Rettig just shook his head and said he wasn't really sure what he was supposed to have just heard. And so the investigator rewound the message again, played it, and then stopped it at that same point. And then did it a few more times, going back to the beginning, playing it and stopping it at that exact same spot. And eventually, Detective Rettig knew why the investigator was so excited. Because in the middle of all the screaming and the crying they had just listened to, Rettig thought he heard Sarah say one word, a name: Mike. Detective Rettig quickly dispatched 2 officers to pick up Lorenzo's younger brother, whose name was Mike, and they found him at his mother's house. Later that day, Rettig sat in an interview room across from Mike, just like he'd done with Lorenzo. But after only a few minutes of speaking to Mike, Rettig felt like these 2 brothers could not be more different. Where Lorenzo had come off as arrogant and uncaring, Mike seemed shy and sensitive. Talking about Sarah's murder clearly upset him. Rettig wondered if maybe Lorenzo, the older and seemingly more domineering of the brothers, had pushed Mike to maybe murder Sarah on his behalf. But Mike stuck to the same story he'd told Rettig when they met at the house. He said he had seen Lorenzo at home before he headed out to work. After the interview, Mike agreed to provide some DNA samples, and he also asked if someone could drive him to work, because he didn't want to be late. Rettig said he'd be happy to, and before long, he was driving Mike across town to his job. And as they drove, Rettig didn't push Mike too hard, but he did say he thought Mike knew more about the murder than he was letting on. Mike didn't respond. However, when Rettig dropped him off at work, Mike stepped out of the car and then fell to the ground and started vomiting. Rettig immediately got out and helped Mike stand back up and get him cleaned off. But as he watched Mike walk into work, Rettig now felt completely sure that Mike, and maybe even his mom Amelia, were hiding information about Lorenzo. As 1998 approached its end, Detective Rettig still felt sure he knew who the killer was. Either Lorenzo had done it himself, or he had gotten someone to do it for him, most likely his younger brother Mike. But before New Year's, the detective got the DNA results he'd been waiting for, and nothing from the crime scene matched Lorenzo or Mike's DNA. This shocked Rettig. He'd been so sure this case was just about closed. But without this scientific evidence, or any other real hard evidence to back him up, he couldn't do anything. So Rettig started to question his own theories about the case. Had he been so locked in on Lorenzo and Mike that he'd ignored other evidence? He went back to the beginning and tried to see what he could have overlooked. And so he dug into Sarah's job at the NSA, thinking maybe the murder could have some connection to her role there. It did seem far-fetched, but if she was involved with sensitive intelligence reports, he at least wanted to look into that. Rettig reached out to a contact at the NSA, and they told him they would look into it. But within days, the NSA contacted Rettig to tell him there was nothing they could find about Sarah's murder that seemed even remotely connected to her work. The fact that Rettig had gone from feeling like he was close to bringing Sarah's killer to justice to feeling like he suddenly had nothing to go on started to weigh heavily on him. He began having trouble sleeping, and he also started seeing that horrific image of Sarah lying there in her house all the time. But no matter what avenue he pursued, nothing new turned up. And so now this case, which had seemed like a slam dunk, started to go cold. On a night in January of 1999, 2 months after Sarah's murder, a 19-year-old sat in his car in the parking lot of a Baltimore McDonald's. The teenager pulled a ski mask down over his face, grabbed a revolver from the passenger seat, and stepped out of the car. He quickly walked across the parking lot, stepped into the near-empty fast food restaurant, raised his gun, and started yelling for everyone who was in there to stay where they were and for the employee behind the counter to hand over all the money from the register. The employee began to panic and couldn't quite get the register open, and so his manager quickly rushed to the counter to help. At the same time, the manager told the teenager with the gun to please calm down and that he would get the money out of the register, just hold on. But the teenager kept waving his gun and yelling at the manager to hurry up. It was taking too long. The manager kept saying he was working on it, and then finally he opened up the register. At which point, the teenager with the gun lunged over the counter and began grabbing the money, but at the same time, the manager of the restaurant must have done something to spook the teen, because the teenager fired his gun and the bullet hit the manager. The employees and the few people in the restaurant began screaming as the teenager ran out of the restaurant with the little bit of money he had in his hand. But the cops were already swarming. On an afternoon in August of 1999, so 7 months after the fast food restaurant robbery and 9 months after Sarah's murder, an officer rushed over to Detective Reddig's desk and told him there was a phone call he had to take. Reddig went to the officer's desk and grabbed the phone, and a detective from nearby Baltimore County introduced himself. This Baltimore County detective said he was pretty sure Reddig had not heard about a Baltimore County McDonald's getting robbed at the beginning of the year. Reddig sort of laughed and said that he had not heard anything about that. The Baltimore County detective said it was the craziest thing, but the person who had robbed that McDonald's and actually shot the manager of that McDonald's was a 19-year-old kid named Ardale Tickles. This kid was in jail for the robbery and the shooting, and recently he'd begun bragging to other inmates that he knew everything about the murder that had been all over the TV, the one where the woman had been killed in Howard County, Sarah Raris. Detective Reddig felt a rush, and he almost didn't know what to say. He'd reached the point where he wasn't sure if he'd ever find any new evidence in Sarah's murder. Still, Reddig knew that inmates often bragged about murders they knew nothing about, especially if those murders had been all over the news for weeks, like Sarah's had. The other detective agreed with Reddig, but he said this was different. He was nearly positive that this kid, Ardale Tickles, had been giving away details of this murder that police had never released to the public. Reddig thanked the detective for the call and said he was heading that way right now. As he rushed out to his car, Reddig felt more optimistic than he had in months, and he thought he might finally find justice for Sarah. And after meeting with the young inmate, Ardale, Detective Reddig was sure Ardale was telling the truth. He did know things that only the killer, or someone who had at least spoken to the killer, would know. It would take a little more time for Reddig and his team to get the concrete evidence they needed, but almost exactly a year after the investigation began, they finally knew who had murdered Sarah Raris. Based on Ardale's interview, DNA testing, and evidence collected throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what happened to Sarah on the night of November 14th, 1998. On that night, the killers sat in their car a few houses down from Sarah's. They slipped on a pair of leather gloves, checked the hunting knife sheathed on their hip, and stepped outside. The killer wore all black, and they moved quickly towards Sarah's house, being careful to stay out of the glow from the streetlights. They ran across Sarah's yard to a window near the front door, crouched down, and looked inside the house. From this spot, they could see Sarah sitting at her computer in the family room. The killer raised up their elbow and slammed it into the glass. The window shattered, and the killer unsheathed their knife, climbed through the broken window, making sure to avoid the shards of glass, and ran right towards Sarah. Sarah was already up on her feet, running towards the phone that was on an end table, but the killer grabbed Sarah and slammed the hunting knife into her back, just as Sarah picked up the phone. The killer kept stabbing Sarah over and over as she desperately tried to dial 911. She didn't manage to do that, but did hit a special speed dial button on her phone that called her best friend Laura. The killer sliced Sarah's hand, and she and the phone fell to the floor. The killer crouched down and stabbed Sarah in the chest again and again until she was barely breathing, and then the killer slit her throat. Sarah died there on the floor, but the killer kept digging into her neck with the knife as they grew more and more crazed. They stabbed Sarah's chest again and then hacked away at her wrists. Finally, the killer saw all the blood on the floor and the walls, and they stood up and backed away from Sarah's body. They ran across the room, grabbed the VCR, and threw some VHS tapes on the floor before heading to the kitchen to throw open some drawers. The killer had wanted to make this look like a robbery, but even they knew this was a very weak attempt, and they didn't want to spend any more time in that house. So they ran back to the broken window, climbed through it, and sprinted across the yard and down the street to their car. And to their shock, the neighborhood still remained completely quiet. Nobody knew. The killer tossed the stolen VCR into the passenger seat, gunned the engine, and sped away from the secluded suburban neighborhood. The following day, they went into work at a retirement home and told the woman they worked with that the job was done. Ardale Tickles, the 19-year-old who robbed the McDonald's and shot the manager, also murdered Sarah. But Ardale had no personal connection to Sarah at all. He just happened to work at the retirement home with Sarah's mother-in-law, Amelia. And it turned out Amelia wanted Sarah dead. Amelia never thought Sarah was good enough for her son Lorenzo. She claimed Sarah was a loose woman and was having all these online relationships with other men. Now, even though there was absolutely no proof of this, Amelia still did not want Lorenzo to be with Sarah. And these feelings only got worse when Sarah and Lorenzo had a baby together. Amelia thought Sarah was a terrible mother, and so whenever Amelia would babysit, she would give Sarah all this unsolicited, extensive parenting advice. But Sarah often rejected her advice. And so Amelia felt disrespected and angry on top of detesting Sarah. And so when Sarah filed for divorce and tried to gain full custody of her grandson, Amelia decided Sarah had to die. Now, Amelia knew she could not carry out the murder herself, so she offered Ardale, the 19-year-old young man she worked with, $3,000 to murder Sarah for her, and Ardale accepted. And for several months after the murder, it looked like Amelia might actually get away with it. Detective Rettig had focused the bulk of his investigation on Amelia's sons, Lorenzo and his brother Mike. Rettig had never even considered Amelia a suspect. And when no concrete evidence against her son surfaced, Amelia believed investigators would just leave the family alone and go down some other path. But in early 1999, Ardale robbed the McDonald's and shot the manager, got caught, and while he was in jail, began bragging to other inmates about how he'd been involved in a highly publicized murder. When Rettig and detectives from Baltimore County interviewed Ardale, he admitted to killing Sarah. It didn't take long for them to connect Ardale and Amelia through their work, and they also eventually connected a bank withdrawal Amelia had made to the payment she'd given Ardale, and so it was clear she had arranged the murder. Police do not believe Lorenzo had any idea what his mother was doing, and although investigators were convinced Lorenzo's brother, Mike, knew more than he was letting on, it was never proven that he had any knowledge of what his mother had done. On top of that, the FBI later conducted a detailed analysis of that voicemail that had been left on Laura's answering machine, the voicemail that basically captured Sarah's murder, and they determined that the word Mike had not actually been said on the tape. It was just a sound that could have been mistaken for the name. And so as a result, the district attorney's office focused their case solely on Amelia and Ardale. Ardale pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison with a possibility for parole as early as 2024. As for Amelia, she was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. In 2018, a 56-year-old father of four named Tayeb Suyami was living in a quiet, modest town in New Jersey called Little Ferry. Tayeb had moved to the United States from Africa back in 1996, and after getting settled in New Jersey, he had landed a job as an accountant for a food importing company. At first, Tayeb's salary had been enough to provide for the family, but as his family grew, his salary just wasn't enough, and money became a real problem. And so eventually, Tayeb's wife also got a full-time job, but even then, with two full-time working adults, the family had to stay on a very strict budget just to make ends meet. And that year, in 2018, one of Tayeb's daughters was getting ready to go to college, and so Tayeb was forced to refinance his mortgage just to make the initial payments on his child's college bills. But despite his financial struggles, Tayeb did not let it bother him. He was an eternal optimist who fundamentally believed that in the end, everything would just work itself out. On May 1st of that year, Tayeb was on his way home from work when his wife called him and asked if he would swing by the grocery store and pick up some orange juice. So Tayeb stopped at the ShopRite grocery store in Hackensack, New Jersey, which was only a couple miles north of Little Ferry where they lived, And he went inside, he went to the juice aisle, and he scanned the different brands of orange juice, and at some point he grabbed the most appealing orange juice that was still within their budget. It was $5. He takes the juice, he goes to the front of the store, he pays for it, he goes outside, he hops in his car, and he heads home. When he pulls into his driveway, he gets out, he goes into the house, he goes right into the kitchen where his wife was, and he proudly set the orange juice down on the kitchen table, expecting a thank you from his wife. But his wife turned around and she looked at the orange juice and she saw the brand he had purchased, and she immediately said, "How much did you pay for that?" And Tayyab said, $5. And she said, "Well, you got to take it back because I know that brand is on sale for $2.50 at the grocery store right down the road. So go return this one." And so Tayyab was totally annoyed because he just got home from work. He thought he had done a good deed and now he's in trouble. And so he decided, you know what? I'm not going to fight her on this. He just walked over, grabbed the $5 orange juice, and he went back outside, hopped in his car, and took off. A few minutes later, he arrived at the Hackensack, New Jersey ShopRite. He went inside and he went straight to the customer service desk where there was a teenager behind the counter. And Tayyab walked over to them and he handed them the juice along with his receipt, and he asked for a refund. And so while Tayyab is standing there letting this cashier complete the transaction, he looked behind the cashier at the wall, and there was this sign that totally piqued his interest. And so he's staring at the sign, and then finally the teenage cashier, he finishes the transaction and he reaches out across the counter with Tayyab's $5. And Tayyab, he reaches out and he takes the $5, but then he pauses for a second. And he's kind of looking up at the sign and he's thinking about what he should do. And he knows that if he does this, if he does what the sign is telling him to do, he's going to get in trouble with his wife because this is the exact opposite of what he was sent out to do. But Tayyab just couldn't help it, and he takes the $5 and he proceeds to hand it right back to the cashier, and he tells the cashier what he wants him to do with it. And so a couple minutes later, Tayyab leaves the ShopRite with no juice, with no $5, but 2 small slips of paper in his back pocket. And so Tayyab hops in his car and he drives to the grocery store that's right down the road from their house. He goes inside and he gets the on sale $2.50 bottle of orange juice. And then he goes back into his car, he drives home, he goes in the kitchen and he sets the juice on the counter and tells his wife, "Yep, I got the right one, $2.50. And he's just hoping the whole time that she has not checked the bank account and has not discovered what he had really been doing while he was out, because he had actually spent more money on the second trip than the first time. But apparently his wife had not checked the account yet, and she just thanked him for being willing to go out and get the better deal. And so Tayyab very happily left the kitchen, and he spent the rest of the night watching TV and hanging out with his family. And then early the next morning, Tayyab got up and he decided, you know what? I need to do something to curry some favor with my wife because she's gonna learn what I did with the refund money pretty soon. And so he decided he would just go out and do a bunch of yard work that day, right in front of his wife, to make sure she really saw that he was doing some good stuff. And so he goes outside, he opens up the garage, and he's about to pull the lawnmower out when he notices his car is really dirty. And so he decides, you know what, I'm gonna go wash my car first and then come back and cut the grass and do some other things. And so he goes inside and he tells his wife what his plan is. And she says, okay, I'll see you in a little bit when you come back from the car wash. And then Tayyab went back outside, he hopped in his car, and he left. As he was driving to the car wash, he made a pit stop at a small store that was set back off the road. And so he goes inside and he goes right to the back of this little store where there's this strange machine that looks like an ATM, and it has a screen on it with text scrolling across it. And at the bottom, there was an opening where a barcode scanner was kind of projecting down. And so Tayyab walks up to this machine and he reaches into his back pocket and he pulls out those 2 slips of paper he had got from the grocery store cashier the night before, and he puts the first one under the scanner, and then he reads the text that appears on the screen of this machine. And after reading it, he kind of shrugs his shoulders and puts that piece of paper back in his pocket. And then the second slip of paper he puts into the scanner. And then when he reads the words that pop up on the screen, he thinks there's been a mistake because all it says is "see receptionist." And so he rescans the second slip of paper to see if something different will happen. But sure enough, again, it just says "see receptionist." And so he pulls the second slip of paper out of the scanner, he turns around and he walks to the front of the store and he hands the paper to the woman behind the counter. Over an hour later, Tayyab pulled into his driveway, and he sat in his driveway for a second. He was still shaking from what had just happened inside of that small store. And so he gets out of his car, which was still totally dirty, and he made his way into the house, and he went straight to the kitchen where his wife was. And so as soon as he gets in the kitchen, his wife turns around and looks at him and says, "Where were you? The car wash is like 5 minutes away. Why were you gone for like 2 hours?" But Tayyab, he's got no expression on his face, and he looks at his wife and just says, "Give me $100. And his wife scrunches her face up at him and says, "No, where's your money?" And Tayyab smiles, he turns around, he reaches into his back pocket, and he pulls out that second slip of paper, and he hands it to his wife, and he says, "Here's my money." After getting that $5 refund at the ShopRite in Hackensack, New Jersey, Tayyab noticed a sign on the back wall that was advertising for a Moneyball jackpot lottery. And he had decided to use the $5 refund to buy 2 lottery tickets. And so he buys these 2 lottery tickets, and the next day, that store set back off the road he went to was a convenience store, a 7-Eleven, and the machine he was using was a machine that scanned your lottery tickets to see if they were winners. And so the first ticket he scanned, it was a dud, it didn't win anything. But the second ticket, when he scanned it, it couldn't process the amount of money he had just won. And so that's why it told him to see the receptionist. And so he brought the second ticket up to the counter, he handed it to the woman, and after she scanned it and saw the amount of money he had won, all she could do was say, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God." And when he asked her, "What are you looking at? What happened?" She just goes, "Big." And so when he got home, Tayyab handed that slip to his wife, and on it was the amount of money that he had won. He was the jackpot winner. He had won $315 million. Tayyab would say that he and his wife and his kids all laughed and cried and celebrated in the kitchen all night. And within a couple of days, Tayyab had left his job, he retired, and he had paid off all of his family's debts. And at his press conference for the New Jersey lottery, he was quoted as saying, "I love orange juice now." Our next story is called Overcoming Adversity. In 1959, Ronald McNair was a very gifted 9-year-old African-American boy living in South Carolina. While he was good at virtually everything he tried, from music to athletics to schoolwork, the only thing that ever really grabbed his attention was outer space. And so as a 9-year-old child, he made the decision that one day he was going to become an astronaut. But he had no idea how to become an astronaut. And so he decided the first thing he would do would be to go to his library and take out some books on NASA, the very famous organization that sends American astronauts to space. However, there was an issue with his plan. This library only served white patrons. It was a segregated library. Ronald knew this, but he figured, you know what? I'm a polite kid. I can get in there and get out before anybody notices me. But as soon as he walked into that library, everybody in there, who were all white, just stared at Ronald. Ronald could feel it, but he just kept his head down and he walked through the library. He got to the science section. He grabbed a couple books he wanted, and then he walked back to the counter and he put them up, and he very politely asked the librarian, who was also white, if he could check these books out. And this librarian looks at him and says, "Young man, you better get out of here before I call the police." And Ronald, at this point, looks up at the librarian and thinks for a second, and then just hops up onto her counter and sits there and says, "Okay, I'll wait for the police." The librarian was totally outraged and would call the police and would call Ronald's mother. And before long, the police did show up, and it was 2 white guys. They come inside, and this librarian runs over to them, and she's talking to them, and she's pointing back over at Ronald, gesticulating that very clearly Ronald is the issue. That's why you've been called here. And the officers would be just totally annoyed by this librarian. And they would say to her, "Why don't you just let the kid take the books out?" And the librarian was totally offended at this and began defending her decision to call the police instead of letting him take the books out. And as she's defending herself, Ronald's mother comes running into the library. She runs over to her son to make sure he's okay. And then she looks up at the police officers and this librarian to try to figure out what's going on. And at this point, the police officers are just totally over it. And they turn to the librarian and they say, "You know what? You really ought to let him take the books out." And then the officers just turned around and left. The librarian was not about to just let him take the books. She was still very upset. And so she storms over to Ronald's mother and she says to her, "You shouldn't let your son come in here." And at this, Ronald's mother is looking at this librarian who's totally upset, and she looks down at her son who's got his head down, and then she notices the few books on the counter about space, and she was aware of Ronald's love for outer space, and she put together what had happened. And after thinking about it for a moment, she looks up at this librarian, and she just says, "Well, since he's here already, can he take out those books? He'll take good care of them." The librarian is still totally furious, but knows this is a losing fight, and so very reluctantly, with a scowl on her face, she grabs the books and she jams them into Ronald's arms. And Ronald's mother nudges Ronald and says, "What do you say?" And Ronald, while holding all of his new books about NASA and space, looks up at the librarian and smiles and says, "Thank you, ma'am." And then he and his mom turn around and they leave. Ronald would go on to earn his PhD in physics from MIT, one of the most prestigious universities in the world, and after graduation, he was picked up by NASA to become an astronaut. And in 1984, Ronald went into outer space. He was actually the second African American to ever go into outer space. And while he was in orbit, apparently he played his saxophone for his crew. And then in 1986, Ronald was chosen again to go on another mission to outer space, but tragically, 73 seconds after takeoff, their space shuttle, the Challenger, exploded, killing Ronald and the 6 other astronauts on board. Following his death, the library in South Carolina that had tried to turn Ronald away for his skin color renamed themselves the Ronald McNair Life History Center. Our next story is called Cowboy. In 1963, when Tim Dick was just 10 years old, he went over to his friend's house and he snuck a bottle of whiskey from one of their shelves. He pulled it out and he poured himself a full glass to the brim with whiskey, and then he downed it in one huge gulp. Tim had grown up idolizing cowboys on TV, and every time he watched them, they would come galloping into some town, they would go into the saloon, and they would sit at the bar just throwing back shots of whiskey. And so Tim always assumed whiskey must be this totally amazing, refreshing drink for these guys to be drinking it out in the heat of the desert. But unfortunately for Tim, after he slugged this huge glass of whiskey, it was not refreshing. It tasted like gasoline, and his chest felt like it was on fire. But instead of being turned off by alcohol and waiting until he was older and of age to try it again, Tim instead thought, you know what? The next time I have whiskey, I just need to water it down a little bit. And so for the next year, Tim continued to periodically sneak whiskey out of his friends' cabinets, and he would drink this watered down whiskey. And then when he turned 11 years old, his father, who he was very close with, died tragically in a car accident. And Tim really didn't have a good way to cope with the grief of losing his father, and so he turned to drinking even more than he already was. And before long, Tim was like this young kid who basically was an alcoholic. But he hid it extremely well. He graduated high school, he graduated college, and really nobody knew he was drinking as much as he was. But after he graduated college and he was living on his own in Michigan, there was no structure in place or person in place to stop Tim from going overboard with his substance abuse. And so not only did his drinking get completely out of control, but he began using and selling drugs, namely cocaine. In 1978, when Tim was 25 years old, he and his drug dealing partner were scheduled to take part in the biggest drug deal of their careers. They would be selling about 1.5 pounds of cocaine to a guy named Michael Pfeiffer, and he'd be buying it for $42,000, which when you adjust that for inflation would be like buying it for $175,000 in 2021. Tim and his partner were very excited about all this money they were going to make, but they were equally worried about the transaction. A lot can go wrong. And so Tim decided, in order to mitigate their nerves and kind of make this a safer drug deal, he decided they would do the transaction inside of a public airport, because Tim had seen that done on TV and believed that would give them an additional layer of safety. And so on the day this deal is going to take place, Tim takes the 1.5 pounds of cocaine, he puts it inside of a brown Adidas gym bag, and he also throws a key lock inside of this bag. He zips it up, he walks outside, he dumps the bag in the back of his car, and he drives to the Kalamazoo International Airport in Michigan. When he gets there, he parks in the big parking lot right outside of the front doors. And as soon as he's parked, he goes around to the back of his car. He pulls out this brown Adidas bag. He throws it over his shoulder, shuts his trunk, and then he waits for his partner to show up. A couple of minutes later, right on time, his partner pulls into the lot. He parks nearby. And then the two of them very casually begin walking towards the front doors of this airport. They walk up the steps, they go in the front doors, and as soon as they're inside, they're looking around and they find Michael Pfeiffer. He's standing up against the wall right in the area he had said he would be. And so without making any sort of contact with Michael, Tim and his partner turn the corner and they go into a nearby locker room. Once they're inside, Tim pulls the lock out of the brown bag and then he puts the bag with the drugs in it inside of a locker. He shuts it and then uses the lock he had just pulled out to lock the locker. And then he and his partner leave the locker room. As soon as they go out into the main terminal, they start walking over towards Michael Pfeiffer. And as they get closer and closer, Tim's partner breaks off and goes to a bench on the other side of the terminal. And Tim continues walking on right up to Michael. And then when he reaches Michael, he very discreetly hands him the key to the lock on the locker. And he tells him which locker number the drugs are in. Michael doesn't say anything. He takes the key and he heads off to the locker room. Tim turns and he goes over to his partner and he sits down on the bench and waits. Meanwhile, Michael goes inside the locker room. He uses the key. He opens up the lock. He opens the locker up. He checks to make sure the drugs are still there. They are. As soon as that's confirmed, he takes the bag, he throws it over his shoulder, and he walks back out to the main terminal to meet up with Tim and his partner. Tim and his partner are sitting on the bench. They see Michael coming out of the locker room, and they're expecting Michael to walk over and basically hand them a bag full of $42,000. But instead, Michael walks up to them and draws a gun and points it at them and says, "I'm a police officer. You're under arrest." It would turn out this was a sting operation. Michael Pfeiffer, the undercover police officer, had been following around Tim and his partner for months. In Michigan at the time, if you were caught trying to sell 650 grams or more of cocaine, there was an automatic penalty of a life sentence. And Tim and his partner had just been arrested trying to sell more than 650 grams of cocaine. And so facing a life sentence, Tim took a deal that gave him a lesser sentence in exchange for information about other drug dealers. And so Tim would ultimately serve 2 years and 4 months in a federal penitentiary before he was released. Tim would say his time in prison was absolutely miserable, but it was necessary. It matured him in a major way, and it honed his sense of humor. Tim was always a very funny guy. He was always the class clown and the guy goofing around. But in prison, he found it a very difficult task to get these hardened prisoners and prison guards to laugh at his jokes. But eventually, with enough practice and repetition, he could get anybody in that prison to laugh at him. And so by the time he got out, he was like an amazing comedian. And so he decided, you know what? Why don't I pursue a career in comedy? 4 years later, Tim Dick, better known as Tim Allen, landed the starring role on the hit TV show Home Improvement. And from there, he starred in dozens more movies and TV shows, but he's probably best known for his voice acting in the very popular movie series Toy Story, where he plays Buzz Lightyear. Today, Tim is sober and has been for decades.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Pick Your Poison.
On June 14th, 2011, 42-year-old Ellie Lobel stepped unsteadily outside of her house in Wildomar, California, and immediately she had to lean on her round-the-clock caretaker for support. This mother of 3 had just moved to this rural part of California so she could die in peace. For the last 15 years, Ellie had been battling Lyme disease, which is a chronic and debilitating condition spread by ticks. But now, after those 15 years of fighting, Ellie just had no more energy. She could barely stand up on her own, her mind was kind of always in this weird fog, and she just felt totally hopeless. And so Ellie had recently hired an end-of-life coordinator to help her plan for her death and also to make sure nobody attempted to revive or resuscitate Ellie if she fell unconscious. Ellie really thought she was going to die any moment and just wanted it to happen in peace in California in her bed. But dying can be complicated, and Ellie, after moving to California, had laid in her bed for 3 days expecting to die, but didn't. And so, on June 14th, Ellie decided she would just get up, and with the help of her caretaker, she would just go for a walk in her new town. Every step was painful for Ellie as she clutched her caretaker's arm, but the sun was out, the sky was blue, and flowers were in bloom all around her, and just for a moment, Ellie suddenly realized she was feeling something she had not felt in a long time. She was feeling grateful to be alive. But that feeling was very short-lived because as she stood on this sunny sidewalk in California, she suddenly felt something small and sharp smack into her forehead. And Ellie, she kind of looked up and realized it was a bee. Now, she was determined not to let an insect ruin this rare instance of happiness in her life. Ellie just kind of reached up and tried to swat it away. But when she looked up again, she noticed the bee was still there, and worse, there was now an entire cloud, a swarm of bees over her head that were descending down on her. And as this happened, Ellie's caretaker, who saw the swarm, screamed, let go of Ellie, and ran away from her. And so poor old Ellie, who couldn't even stand up on her own, was forced to fall to the ground and kind of cover her head with her hands to try to protect herself. But within seconds, these bees had descended on her and were stinging her head, her ears, her face. I mean, she was getting destroyed. And these were not normal bees. These were African killer bees that were known for stinging their victim dozens of times. And Ellie was fiercely allergic to bee stings. And so instead of dying a peaceful death in her bed, Ellie was now going to die a viciously painful, awful public death out on the sidewalk all by herself. Ellie's life had started out with so much promise. By the time she was just 18 years old, she had already earned her PhD in physics. And then by 1996, when she was 27 years old, Ellie and her husband had 3 beautiful children, and they had moved into their dream home in New York's Westchester County. Her life really seemed perfect. But that same year they moved into their dream home, Ellie suddenly noticed there was this rash at the top of her thigh, and it kind of looked like a red bullseye, and Ellie had chalked it up to, some sort of weird spider bite and not thought much of it, not realizing that that bullseye marking is actually the calling card for ticks who carry Lyme disease. That's what they leave behind after they bite you. But Ellie didn't know that, and so not long after seeing this rash, Ellie began having night sweats and night shakes. She had these flu-like symptoms that didn't go away for months, and it left her totally exhausted and discouraged. Doctors told her that she could have arthritis, or fibromyalgia, or MS, or heart failure, or some other horrible condition, but it was ultimately a park ranger that Ellie just happened to meet one day who recognized that that rash she described at the top of her leg was very likely because she had been bit by a tick that had Lyme disease, and now all of these symptoms, that seemed like Lyme disease too. And then when Ellie went into the doctor and said, I think I have Lyme disease, they said, yep, you do, but now the disease has progressed so far, it's basically too late for you. And so for years, Ellie wasn't able to work or really even be a mother because of this disease. And then eventually her marriage fell apart and ended in bitter divorce. And so this disease really had just kind of wrecked Ellie's life. And so at the 15-year mark of having this disease, she decided, you know what, enough is enough. I'm going to California and I'm going to die on my own terms. But Ellie had envisioned a peaceful death in her bed, not an agonizing death caused by a barrage of African killer bee stings out on a sidewalk in some random town in California. The attack on Ellie lasted maybe about a minute, but it was the longest minute of Ellie's life. The pain was just unimaginable. And then after all the bees had left, Ellie's caretaker actually came running back over to her, scooped her up, and began running with her back to the car. And as Ellie was getting carried, Ellie realized her caretaker was probably going to take her to the hospital, and she didn't want that. Even though she had had that kind of nice moment before the bee stings when she was looking around at this beautiful town and the sun was out and the flowers were out, that wasn't enough to inspire her to want to live. She still, deep down, did just want to die. And so she figured, with these bee stings, I'm going to have an allergic reaction any minute now, and that's going to take me out, and I just want it to happen so I can be done. And so Ellie made her caretaker drive her back to the house and put her in bed, and then Ellie laid there waiting to die. But 3 days later, and Ellie had not died yet. In fact, she actually felt the best she had felt in years. There had been no discernible allergic reaction to all of these bee stings all over her head, and all the chronic pain and discomfort that she normally felt all the time from Lyme disease was gone. And after doing some research about bee stings and about Lyme disease, Ellie came across this 1997 study done in Australia that found the active ingredient in some wasp and bee stings was powerful enough to kill the bacteria that causes Lyme disease. But no one had ever really researched this because it was totally unethical to release a swarm of bees on a critical Lyme disease patient. But in Ellie's case, this happened on its own, and it really did cure her. The bee stings literally saved her life. And since her bee attack, Ellie has become the leading advocate for bee venom as a treatment for Lyme disease.
The tide, it brings you in, then lets you go. I know I should get back my mother's stress. Old medals that you earned, they mean much less. Early morning, set my sails back to shore. Paradise return, useless metaphor. I'm out there in the swamp trying hard to start.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, Mr. Ballen Podcast, and we also have Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which